Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to my 53rd episode. Tonight, I want to take a look at the second part of Isaiah 10, which will be verses 20 through 34. Before we get into those verses, I want to give a quick recap of what was playing out in verses 1 through 19 of this chapter. The Assyrian Empire conquered Israel and Syria, but they failed in their attempt to take down Judah. The people of Israel and Judah had grown twisted and warped, and had put their faith in idols. The Assyrian king, Sennacherib, allowed his military conquests to go to his head, and he became quite arrogant. This led to God's judgment against Assyria, when the angel of the Lord destroyed Assyria's army as they sat camped outside of Judah's capital city, Jerusalem. That is the revelation that was given to the prophet Isaiah in the first 19 verses of this chapter. The second part of this chapter expands on that revelation. So let's begin by taking a look at verses 20 and 21. In that day, the remnant left in Israel, the survivors in the house of Jacob, will no longer depend on allies who seek to destroy them, but they will faithfully trust the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, yes, the remnant of Jacob will return to the mighty God. So, Isaiah is seeing a future when the Assyrian army is destroyed, and a small number of God's people will no longer depend on Assyria. Instead, they will put their faith in God. Contrast this with how both Israel under Menahem and Judah under Ahaz attempted to purchase safety from the Assyrian Empire by sending gifts to the Assyrian king. God brought down Assyria because they had become arrogant, but he also brought them down so that his people would stop trying to rely on them. With the threat of the Assyrian Empire diminished, Israel would turn away from their handmade idols and toward God. In chapter 17, Isaiah says that the people will finally look to their Creator and put their eyes on the Holy One of Israel. They will no longer bow down to their Asherah poles and worship at their pagan shrines. Remember how God instructed Isaiah to name one of his sons Shear-Jashub? That name meant a remnant will return. Here we see this idea of a remnant of God's people returning to their homeland and to God. Ezra placed the number of people who returned to Judah at 49,897, and that figure includes the servants and the singers. These were the people who remained faithful to God despite the horrors of the invasion. The key to being counted among the remnant was faith. It didn't matter if you were a descendant of Abraham, or if you lived in the Promised Land, or if you had trusted God at one time in the past. None of those conditions were good enough. When it came to the remnant, the only part that mattered was faith. Today, faith is still the only way into God's family. And we should be thankful that God designed salvation this way. Imagine the pressure we would have to live with if God expected us to earn our way into a right relationship with Him. This is one of the elements of Christianity that makes it distinct from every other worldview. That salvation is freely given to us by God as the ultimate expression of His self-sacrificial love. We only qualify to be with Him because He loves us. And we know that our own relationship with Him is founded on love because He's given us the freedom to choose. And so imagine, instead, if you were depending on your church or its leadership to facilitate your relationship with God. If you elevate people into the place only God should occupy, you are bound for disappointment on the same scale as betrayal. If you get close enough to anyone, you will begin to see their flaws and their sinful nature. And this can be a very painful experience if you are making the mistake of trying to deify the person or hold them to the same perfect standard that only God can meet. And so, that's what God has accomplished by using Syria to judge His people. He's shifted their dependence away from other people and idols, and onto him. Those who have done this are the ones called the remnant. Let's pick up in verses 22 and 23. But though the people of Israel are as numerous as the sand of the seashore, only a remnant of them will return. The Lord has rightly decided to destroy his people. Yes, the Lord of heaven's armies, has already decided to destroy the entire land. Paul quotes this passage in Romans chapter 9 when he is discussing the history of Israel. It was disturbing for Paul that everywhere he preached, he saw Jews who were trying to please God through their performance at keeping the law. He even said that he would be willing to cut himself off from Christ forever if that would save his fellow Jews. You have to imagine that Paul, being a Pharisee of Pharisees, knew exactly what the Jews were thinking and experiencing. It's kind of like when something terrible happened to you in the past and you see someone else going through it right now. You have a special kind of appreciation for their pain because you yourself remember what it felt like. This should be one of the motivating factors behind our evangelism. Those of us who can remember living without Christ, remember what it feels like to be hopeless in the face of death and to feel the weight of meaninglessness sap the joy out of our lives. We should do what we can to lead our brothers and sisters away from that and into a more peaceful existence. Okay, let's look at verse 24. So this is what the Lord of heaven's armies says. O my people in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrians when they oppress you with rod and club, as the Egyptians did long ago. I want to talk to you a little bit about just how horrible it was to face an Assyrian invasion. Every Assyrian male was required to serve in the military, from the richest to the poorest. The soldiers would work in 3-year cycles. The first year, they would build infrastructure like roads and bridges. This helped build up the strength of the men and of the empire. In the second year, the soldiers would go to war. Then, in the third year, they would go home to be with their families. Then the cycle would start all over again. And this process created soldiers who were incredibly battle-hardened. You can actually see symptoms of what appears to be widespread PTSD in much of the early Assyrian writings. The soldiers would be exposed to such horrific scenes that they couldn't forget it when they returned home. A typical Assyrian invasion looked something like this. The army would approach and an envoy would come to the city and offer you a chance to surrender. If you surrendered, you could be tortured so badly that news of what they did to you would spread to the next city they intended to invade. The Assyrians used this type of psychological warfare because they wanted to demoralize the people in each territory before they even showed up to conquer it. So God is speaking through Isaiah and telling his people not to fear. He's referencing the oppression they faced in Egypt before the Exodus. Some of the torture that the Israelites had to endure in Egypt included being forced to make bricks without any straw and being beaten when they couldn't satisfy the quotas. God wants his people to know that he is watching out for them now under Assyria just as he did back when they were under Egypt. Let's look at verses 25 and 26. In a little while, my anger against you will end, and then my anger will rise up to destroy them. The Lord of heaven's armies will lash them with his whip, as he did when Gideon triumphed over the Midianites at the rock of Oreb, or when the Lord's staff was raised to drown the Egyptian army in the sea. So, God is telling them that there is light at the end of the tunnel and that he intends to deliver them out of the hands of Assyria. I really like the way Isaiah puts this in chapter 17, when he says, "In the evening, Israel waits in terror, but by dawn its enemies are dead." This is the just reward of those who plunder us, a fitting end for those who destroy us. Now, look at verse 26 where Isaiah references Gideon's victory over the Midianites and Moses using the Lord's staff to part the Red Sea. This is meant to show the Israelites that God can deliver them out of any circumstance, no matter how bleak it looks. Okay, verse 27. In that day, the Lord will end the bondage of his people. He will break the yoke of slavery and lift it from their shoulders. This verse is written the way that it is found in the Greek version of the manuscripts. In the Hebrew, this verse reads, "The yoke will be broken, for you have grown so fat." In chapter 14, God speaks through Isaiah and says that his people will no longer be under the heavy load of their enemies because he will break the Assyrians while they are in Israel. Okay, verse 28. Look, the Assyrians are now at Aiath. They are passing through Migron and storing their equipment at Michmash. They are crossing the pass and are camping at Geba. Fear strikes the town of Ramah. All the people of Gibeah, the hometown of Saul, are running for their lives. Scream in terror, you people of Galim. Shout out a warning to Laisha. Oh, poor Anathoth. There go the people of Madmenah, all fleeing. The citizens of Gabim are trying to hide. The enemy stops at Nob for the rest of that day. He shakes his fist at beautiful Mount Zion, the mountain of Jerusalem. Okay, so the way that these cities are listed gives us an approximate estimate of the route that Assyria took to get to Judah in 701 BC. They would go from Aiath at the northern border all the way down to Nob, which was just 2 miles from Jerusalem. You didn't want to live in any of these cities when the Assyrians were on the warpath. We know that they were very cruel to the people they conquered, and it was nearly impossible to stop them until the Lord himself stood in their way at Jerusalem that fateful night. That's where we pick up in verse 33. But look, the Lord of heaven's armies, will chop down the mighty tree of Assyria with great power. He will cut down the proud. That lofty tree will be brought down. He will cut down the forest trees with an axe. Lebanon will fall to the mighty one. Describing Assyria as a lofty tree was a way of saying that it was one of the world's most prominent superpowers. Ezekiel used this language when comparing Egypt, another world superpower, to Assyria. Amos also referred to the Amorites as having great power and strength, yet being cut down by the Lord. These examples should serve as a warning to every powerful nation today. It's easy to get into the habit of thinking that a catastrophe could never happen in your own nation because of its prominence on the world stage. But the Bible shows us that no nation is too powerful to defy the judgment of God. And so we should be careful to avoid incurring it to begin with. If you find this content valuable, feel free to share it and to use it in your own studies. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so at www.patreon.com/Michael H. Bond. There is a link in the description. Your generosity goes a long way to promoting the growth of this enterprise and the cause of free speech. Thank you all for joining me this evening, and I will see you in the next episode.